She laughed at her cat's strange gift, until the glove led her to someone. Jasper had always been a thief. Not a guilty one. Not the kind of cat who hid under the bed afterward and waited to see whether you were angry. He brought things home the way most cats bring home mice, which is to say, proudly, deliberately, with the bearing of an animal who had thought the whole plan through and found it excellent. Mara had long since stopped being surprised by what she found at her feet in the morning. A yellow bottle cap from the gas station 3 blocks over. A child's single mitten, orange, with a small embroidered sun on the thumb. 4 different buttons over the course of one spring, each from a different coat, as though Jasper had developed opinions about fashion. Once, memorably, a partial set of car keys that she never did find the owner of. She kept them in a wide ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, the blue one with the small chip on the rim that had been her grandmother's. Each object dropped in, nestled against the others, the small and strange archive of wherever Jasper had been and what he'd found worth saving. This was their routine, his and hers together. He would arrive at her bedroom door sometime between 5 and 6 in the morning, object held with great ceremony in his teeth, and she would say, "What did you find?" in the same low voice she used when speaking to him about anything at all, and he would drop it and sit back with his tail curled around his feet and watch her pick it up. She always made a sound, a small, involuntary laugh, or a murmur of recognition, or once, when he'd brought her a single square of sandpaper that smelled faintly of sawdust, a look of puzzled delight that had lasted half the morning. She had been living alone for 2 years. The bowl of objects was the only thing in the house that felt like a surprise anymore. It was early November, the 2nd week, when she first smelled the difference. She heard him before she saw him, the familiar padding down the hallway, the pause at the bedroom door, the soft sound of him setting something down. She was already half awake, lying in the dark listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods in the backyard, the way she often lay now in that pre-morning hour, not asleep but not quite ready to be awake either. She reached down without looking and picked it up. The weight was wrong, too heavy. She sat up and turned on the lamp. It was a glove, men's work glove, brown leather, the kind with a rough patch of grip across the palm, size large. Her hand disappeared inside it when she tried it on without meaning to. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It was absurd. She said, "Jasper, where on earth?" But the sentence didn't need finishing because he was already sitting in the doorway, watching her with the particular satisfaction of a cat who has done exactly what he intended. She held the glove up to the lamp. The leather was stiff in places, cold. She pressed the palm against her cheek the way she pressed her hand to a child's forehead to check for fever. It was damp, not from outside rain. The morning had been clear, damp in the way something gets when it has been sitting somewhere cold and wet for several hours. The inside of the wrist cuff carried a faint smell that was not Jasper, and not the neighborhood, and not anything she owned. She put it on the counter next to the bowl. She did not put it in the bowl. She made coffee, and told herself it was nothing. Animals drag things in all the time. Someone had left a glove on the sidewalk, and Jasper had found it on one of his overnight expeditions, the ones she usually tried not to think too hard about, because she lived alone, and worrying about a cat was a particular kind of lonely that she had not yet made peace with. She went to work. She taught 3rd grade at Monroe Elementary, and spent 8 hours in the specific useful exhaustion of other people's children, which was the thing she was best at, and the thing that had saved her, mostly, in the 2 years since Thomas had died. That night, Jasper sat at the back door and cried. Not his usual cry. Not the short, impatient sound he made when his bowl was empty, or the sharp trill he used when birds appeared on the fence. This was sustained, low, directed at the door, with an attention that made her set down her book. She opened the door. He looked out into the dark for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the kitchen and sat in front of the counter where the glove was. She stood in the kitchen in her socks, looking at the glove, for longer than she could explain. 4 days passed before the second glove arrived. She had almost succeeded in not thinking about it. Almost. But the first glove stayed on the counter because she hadn't decided what to do with it. And every morning when she made coffee, it was just there, slightly to the right of the bowl, alone. On a Wednesday, she woke to Jasper's weight on the foot of the bed and reached down to find him curled in a tight circle, which was unusual. He generally preferred to drop his offering and leave. She reached past him and her fingers closed on leather. She knew before she looked. The matching glove, Right hand, same brown leather, same size. The cuff was slightly mud-stained in a way the first one wasn't. She held the two of them together, one in each hand, and the laughter did not come. The finger seam on the right glove was torn at the seam between the index and middle fingers, the kind of tear that happens after long use, not accident. She ran her thumb across it. Someone wore these gloves every day, someone who worked with their hands. She turned the left one over and looked at the cuff. The mud there was a specific color, dark gray with a fine silt texture, the kind that only came from one place she could think of in a town this size, the river. She took the gloves to Dolores that afternoon, knocking on the fence door rather than walking around the block the way normal people did. Dolores was 81 and had lived in the same house for 54 years and knew things about this neighborhood that could have filled a book nobody would believe. "I'm not asking you to spy," Mara said. "I'm asking if you've seen anyone near the back alley lately." Dolores considered this with the unhurried attention she gave to most things. "There's a man," she said. "Sits by the river sometimes. I see him on my walk, Tuesday mornings mostly. He's not a bother. He has a fire ring down there in the cottonwoods, the little clearing past the third bend." She paused. "He has sad eyes, but most people have sad eyes if you look long enough." Mara went home and put both gloves on the counter, matched and together now, and looked at them for a while. She told herself she would walk to the river that weekend. She went the next morning before school. The trail along the river was quiet in the gray cold of November. The cottonwood leaves turned brown and mostly gone, the water running low and flat between its banks. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her breath making small clouds that disappeared into the still air. She didn't know what she was looking for. Not exactly. She told herself she was just walking. She found the clearing past the third bend. There was a fire ring made of river stones, neatly arranged, with a small pile of wood beside it, covered with a piece of plastic sheeting. There was a sleeping bag rolled under a canvas tarp, tied between two trees. There was a blue cooler and a stack of paperback books with a brick on top to keep them from blowing. Everything in the camp was orderly, cared for, with the particular organization of a person who has very little and protects what they have. The man was sitting with his back against the largest cottonwood, his knees drawn up, looking at the river. He was somewhere around 58, she thought, though she would revise this later. His coat was a tan canvas work jacket, not insulated enough for November, and his hands were bare. His hair was mostly gray, cut practically short. He had the kind of face that probably looked better when he was less tired. He looked at her without alarm, not with welcome either, but without alarm. She said, "Good morning." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Morning," she said. "I'm Mara. I live up the hill, 3 blocks. She pointed with her chin. He said nothing. She said, "My cat has been bringing things home. I think some of them might be yours." Something shifted in his face then, not quite surprise, but close to it. He looked at her hands, and then at the river, and then back at her hands. "Your cat," he said. "Gray tabby. Named Jasper. He's been coming down here, I think, and taking things." She paused. "He left your gloves at my bedroom door." A silence. Then he laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him against his apparent intentions. He pressed his mouth together after it, but it had been real. "Dale," he said. He didn't stand up and he didn't offer his hand, but he said his name, and she understood this as an offering of its own kind. She looked at his bare hands. The knuckles were red from the cold. She had the strong and specific impulse to say something, to offer something, and she stopped herself because she recognized the expression on his face. She had sat across from it at a hospital bedside for 8 months, and she knew it by heart. The expression of a person who has accepted that their life no longer requires other people's concern. She sat down on a log about 6 feet away from him. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. The river moved past them, gray and easy, and a crow called from somewhere in the upper branches, and for a few minutes it was just the cold and the water, and the two of them sitting with the space between them. Then she asked if he'd eaten anything that day. He said not yet. She said she'd be back in an hour. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. She stood up, brushed her coat off, and walked back up the trail. Behind her she heard only the river. He had been feeding Jasper scraps. She found this out on the 3rd visit, when she'd started bringing sandwiches and hot coffee in a thermos, and Dale had begun, in the careful way of a man unaccustomed to conversation, to say a few things. He'd been coming to this particular bend of the river for about a month. The cat had appeared in his camp on the 4th night, walked directly up to him with no hesitation whatsoever, and accepted half a piece of beef jerky. He came back every night after that, Dale said. He wrapped both hands around the thermos cup in a way that told her they were still cold all the time. I thought he was a stray. He's not, Mara said. He's extremely housed. He has a heated bed. He has opinions about food brands. Huh, Dale said. He looked at the cup. Smart animal. She told him about the bowl on the counter, about Jasper's habit of bringing things home. She described the bottle caps, and the child's mitten, and the car keys that had never been claimed. Dale listened the way certain people listen, with his full attention but without any particular expression, the way someone listens when they haven't had much practice recently and are being careful to get it right. When she finished, she said, "And then he brought your gloves." "I left them on a log," Dale said. "Washed my hands in the river. When I came back, they were gone." He paused. "I thought someone passing by had taken them." "He took them. He took both of them, 4 days apart." He looked at her then with something almost like amusement in his eyes, though it was faint and cautious. 4 days apart, he repeated. She had brought the gloves back. She pulled them from her coat pocket and held them out, and he took them with both hands, turned the right one over, pressed his thumb against the torn seam on the finger. He held them for a moment longer than was necessary, and then put them on. The relief in his face was small and almost hidden, but she had been watching people's faces carefully for 2 years, and she did not miss it. She described the bowl of objects to him on the next visit. She told him about putting each thing inside it, the specific pleasure of not knowing what would arrive next. Dale listened. Then he said, "The cat had been eating with me for weeks before you came." She understood what he was saying. Not the literal fact of it, though that was true too. He was saying that Jasper had been building something between their 2 lives without either of them knowing, going back and forth along the 3-block stretch between the river and her kitchen, carrying scraps and gloves and the particular smell of a person, threading 2 separate solitudes together with whatever he could find worth carrying. She looked at the bowl of objects that evening and thought about that for a long time. She didn't sleep the night the temperature dropped to 7 degrees. She lay under 2 blankets and listened to the wind and thought about the canvas jacket that was not insulated enough for November, and how November had become January without warning, and it was not November anymore. She thought about hands that were red from the cold. She thought about a fire ring with a neat pile of covered wood and a sleeping bag that was not rated for temperatures like this. She got up at 4 in the morning and sat in the kitchen in the dark with the lights off and Jasper in her lap, and she made herself not drive to the river until it was light, because going to a man's camp at 4 in the morning was not something she could explain, not to him and not to herself. At first light she drove. He was there. He had the fire going, and he was sitting close to it, and his face was drawn tight in the way a face gets when it has been cold for many hours. He looked at her when she came through the trees, and his expression was the careful, neutral expression of someone who has learned to show very little. She said, "I have a spare room." He looked at the fire. "It has a door that locks," she said. "Jasper is annoying but manageable. I go to work at 7:30 and come home at 4. You would have the house to yourself most of the day." She paused. "It's just until it warms up," he said. "That's kind of you." The phrasing of this, the particular formal distance of it, told her exactly what was coming. He said, "I'm fine." She looked at the fire and his face and his bare hands, where the gloves had already come off again, because you can't wear gloves every minute of the day, and the red on his knuckles had gone to white in the time it had taken her to walk through the trees. She said, "Okay." She drove home. She sat in the driveway for a while with the engine off, and she cried. Not dramatically, not the way she'd cried those first months after Thomas, when it had been everything all at once. This was quieter. She cried for the specific patience required to watch someone refuse help and not be able to argue with the reasons for the refusal, because the reasons were real and human and made complete sense. She went inside and Jasper was waiting at the door the way he often was when she'd been gone, sitting on his back legs with his front paws together, and he had something in his mouth. She took it from him. It was a piece of flannel. Dark green, worn soft. The edge cut unevenly, as though it had been torn from something larger. It smelled like wood smoke in the river, and the specific human smell she associated now, with 3 blocks, and a cleared camp, and a name she'd heard only once. She sat on the kitchen floor with the flannel in her lap. Jasper climbed onto her thigh and put his head against her chest, and she held him there, and talked to him for a while in the low, honest voice she used when no one else could hear. She told him about Dale. She told him about the room with the locking door. She told him about the 7-degree wind chill and the canvas jacket. She told him she didn't know if it was her business, and she thought about that for a while, and decided that it was, because Jasper had made it her business, and she trusted Jasper's judgment more than she trusted her own ability to walk away from a person sitting next to a fire in January at 7 degrees. She was not helping Dale because she felt sorry for him. She had spent enough time around her own grief to know the difference between pity and recognition, and what she felt was the second thing. She recognized in Dale the specific stillness of a person waiting for nothing, not in despair but in the particular quiet that comes after enough loss. She recognized it because she had lived inside it. She did not go back that day. The next morning she went to REI and bought a sleeping bag rated to -20. It cost her $162. She did not think about this very hard. She drove to the camp and walked through the trees and put the sleeping bag, still in its stuff sack, down next to the fire ring, and she did not say anything. She turned around and walked back to the car. 3 days later, she found a note tucked under the loose stone on the corner of her back step, the one that had been loose for 2 years, and that she had always meant to fix. 2 words. Thank you. She put the note in the bowl. December was cold, but not January cold, and the visits continued, and Dale talked a little more each time. Not all at once. Nothing came all at once. He talked the way careful people talk, offering one piece and then waiting, and if you responded the right way, offering another. He had been a carpenter. His shop had been 12 years of his life. The thing he'd built from a single truck and a set of hand tools into something that employed 4 people and had a 3-month waiting list. The recession had hollowed it, then a lease dispute, then the divorce that had been coming before all of that, but that arrived in the aftermath of it, when there was nothing left to buffer the things he and his wife had been avoiding. 2 years, not dramatic, not one terrible thing, a series of ordinary terrible things, each one survivable on its own, together not survivable. She told him about Thomas, not everything, not the hospital or the months at the end. She told him that she'd been alone for 2 years, and that she'd found the aloneness manageable, and sometimes even okay, but that she'd also spent a great deal of time talking to a cat, so her standards for what constituted a satisfying conversation had shifted considerably. Dale looked at Jasper, who had come along today in his carrier and was sitting with the carrier door open, watching both of them with his particular quality of attention that was somehow both relaxed and completely focused. "He's a serious animal," Dale said. "He is." Mara paused. "He's been coming here for months, apparently, without me knowing. I thought he was just wandering the neighborhood. He came the first night," Dale said. "Just sat across the fire from me. Didn't want anything. Just sat there." She looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at the fire. "He was keeping you company," she said. Dale didn't answer immediately. He watched the cat. Then he said, "I had a cat in the shop. Different cat, years ago. A big orange thing that someone left in a box on the step. He used to sleep on the workbench, right in the middle of whatever I was doing." A pause. Made it very difficult. She understood this was not a casual story. She did not treat it as one. She let it sit between them in the cold air for a moment, the weight of it there, and then receding to something more manageable. Jasper got up and walked across the camp and stepped directly into Dale's lap and turned 3 circles and lay down. Dale sat very still. He put one hand on the cat's back and held it there, not stroking, just resting. Jasper started to knead. She watched his face without appearing to watch his face. She had learned to do this with 3rd graders when they were saying something hard and didn't want to be caught saying it. After a minute, Dale said, "He's heavy. He eats very well," she said. The moment passed into the next one. Later that visit, she showed him a picture on her phone, the bowl of objects on the kitchen counter, and told him the full catalog. He looked at each item she described. When she got to the gloves, he said, "I should have asked where they went," she said. "You didn't know there was someone to ask." "No," he said. "I didn't." The bowl of objects sat in the back of her mind that evening with a different meaning than it had before. It wasn't just Jasper's collection anymore. It was a record of all the distance between two people that a cat had quietly, persistently, without any particular plan or foresight, decided to close. The night it dropped to -4, she went to the camp and the fire ring was empty. She stood in the clearing for a full minute, her heart doing the specific thing it had learned to do in the last 2 years in the presence of absence, the involuntary calculus of what might have happened. She found him at the laundromat on 4th Street, sitting in a plastic chair with the sleeping bag in the dryer and a cup of coffee from the machine. He looked at her when she came in. Not surprised. Not quite. Something else. She sat down next to him. "Smart," she said, meaning the laundromat, the heat. "Warm," he said. They sat for a while in the sound of the dryers. She said, "How long do you think you can keep this up?" He considered the question with honest attention. He was a person who answered questions honestly. She had learned this much. "I don't know," he said. "The room is still available," she said. "I'm not going to keep asking. This is the last time." He looked at his coffee cup. The dryers hummed. She said, "There's also a full woodworking bench in my garage that belonged to my husband, that I've almost donated to the Habitat Restore twice, and somehow never managed to. I don't know what I was waiting for." She paused. "Maybe this." He looked at her then. The full look, not the careful sideways attention he usually gave. Something in it she recognized as the specific human experience of being offered something you had stopped believing was meant for you. "I have a haul," she said, "that has needed a table for 2 years. He sat with this. "I'm not asking you to owe me anything," she said. "I'm asking you to build me a table and live in a warm room. Those can just be 2 separate things." He looked at the window. Outside the street was lit orange by the streetlights, and the cold was doing what cold does in January, which is to treat everything in the world as equally indifferent to it. He said, "I'd need to see the hall." She said, "Come see it." He stood in the doorway of her house for a full minute before stepping in. She stood a few feet back and let him do this because she understood that it was a doorway, and doorways mean things. She had stood in several herself in the past 2 years, before entering a room that Thomas had last been in, before crossing into the hospital the morning he died. Dale stepped inside. The hall was narrow, with original wood floors and a brass light fixture that she had never quite liked. The wall on the right had a specific quality of scuff about waist height, where the corner of a sideboard had rubbed for years and years before Thomas had moved it to the living room in a rearrangement that had never felt quite finished, that he had died before they could fix. Dale looked at the scuff. He looked at the floor. He looked at the dimensions of the space with his eyes moving in the slow, precise way of someone who thinks in measurements. "The piece you had here before," he said. "Legs probably about 1.25 inches, tapered. It would have been lighter than it looked." She stared at him. "The scuff pattern," he said, nodding at the wall. "You can tell by the angle and the height," she said. "You're right." She said it slowly. "It was a sideboard. Thomas bought it at an estate sale. The legs were tapered." Dale looked at the floor again and said nothing. Jasper appeared from the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, and walked directly to Dale's left boot. He sat on it. Dale looked down. The laugh came again. The second one, shorter than the first but real, just as real, surprised out of him by the same specific quality of absurdity. "He does that," Mara said. "I see." They had coffee at the kitchen table, and she moved the bowl of objects to make room, and Dale saw it, and she told him the full story this time, everything in it. The bottle cap and the mitten and the car keys and the flannel that was definitely his, still in there, and the note. She didn't take the note out, but she told him it was in there. He listened. Then he said, "I didn't know cats did that." "Neither did I," she said. "I mean, I knew he brought things home, but I thought it was random, shiny things, things that smelled interesting." She paused. "I didn't know he was going to the same place every time." Dale looked at the bowl. He was quiet for a moment. "How long do you think he'd been going there before the gloves?" he asked. She thought about it. "The first strange smell I noticed on him was October, I think. Maybe late September." He nodded slowly. He picked up the right-hand glove from the bowl, the one with the torn seam, and turned it over in his hands the way he had turned it over the first time she'd handed it back to him at the camp. He held it for a moment. He put it back. Before he left, he stood in the hall one more time and looked at the empty space below the brass light. She watched from the doorway. "Quarter sawn oak," he said. "If you can get it. Better for a haul than plain sawn, more stable with the humidity changes." She said she could get whatever he needed. He said he'd think about dimensions. He went out the door into the cold, and she watched the door close and stood in the hall by herself for a while, listening to the house. He came back twice in January, and on the second visit he asked to see the garage. She opened the door and turned on the light and stepped aside. The workbench ran along the entire right wall. 8 feet of Douglas fir surface, solid and level, with a row of drawers below and a clamping track. Thomas had installed himself one winter weekend. Above it, the tools were hanging on a pegboard, organized in a way Thomas would have described as logical, but that mostly reflected an argument they'd had about whether hammers should be grouped by size or by function, which Thomas had won. The whole bench had a layer of dust that was particular in its way. The dust of things kept intact, but not used, things preserved without purpose. Dale stood in the center of the garage and looked at it. He walked to the bench and put both hands on the surface, pressing his palms flat against the wood. He ran one hand along toward the far corner slowly, the way you run a hand along a wall in the dark to find where you are. He didn't speak for a while. Mara stood by the door. She did not fill the silence. Eventually he said, "He kept this well." "He tried," she said. "He wasn't a carpenter. He was a high school history teacher. He just liked having tools." Dale looked at the pegboard. He reached up and unhooked a hand plane from its spot, turned it over, ran his thumb along the blade bevel. He hooked it back. "I can work in here," he said. She said, "Good." He started the following Saturday. She heard the garage door go up at 7 in the morning and got up and made 2 cups of coffee and brought one out without being asked and set it on the far corner of the workbench. He nodded. The table took 3 weeks. She did not watch every minute. She was not that kind of person, she thought, though it turned out she was a little bit. She found herself drifting to the garage doorway with one excuse or another. A question about the spare room, a thing she needed from the shelf, the specific and transparent pretense of a person who wants to watch something good happening without wanting to seem like she's watching. Dale worked in a particular quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, not the absence of conversation quiet, but the focused quiet of a person in their element, where words would be an intrusion. She learned to sit in it with him. She brought coffee at 7 and sometimes at 11, and they drank it without talking much, and then she went back inside, or he went back to the plane, or the chisel, or the careful repetition of fitting one piece to another until the joint was exactly right. Jasper supervised. He had decided, with no discussion and no consultation, that the garage was his new domain. He slept on the wood shavings beneath the workbench, which Dale tolerated. He walked across the work surface at least once every morning, which Dale did not quite tolerate but accepted as inevitable. He sat directly on the piece of oak being worked on at a frequency that could only be described as deliberate, on 3 separate occasions managing to plant himself precisely where the next cut was supposed to go. "He's helping," Mara said. "He is not helping," Dale said, but he moved the cat with a gentle hand and did not seem to mind the delay. She watched the table take shape across those weeks. The legs came first, turned on a lathe she'd been surprised to find stored in the corner behind a tarp, tapered just slightly, more graceful than functional necessity required. The top came next, quarter-sawn oak milled to a perfect thickness, the grain running in long, clean lines. And then the drawer, small, right side, with a wooden pull that Dale shaped from a piece of scrap and fitted by hand until it moved in and out with a single smooth motion, no resistance at all. The dovetails at the top corners were the last thing. She watched him cut them one afternoon, the handsaw moving in careful, measured strokes, and then the chisel cleaning each angle down to nothing, and the process of testing the fit over and over, fitting and removing and paring a sliver more and fitting again, until the joint closed and he pressed the pieces together with his palms, and there was no gap anywhere and it looked like it had been made from one piece of wood rather than 2. She said without thinking, "That's beautiful." He looked at her briefly and then looked at the joint. "Close," he said. "Acceptable." She understood this was approximately the same thing. On the day he carried the table into the hall, they stood side by side and looked at it. The brass light fixture was directly above. The light fell on the grain of the oak in the specific way that quarter-sawn lumber catches light, the medullary rays running in silver lines across the surface, moving with the angle of your view. The drawer was on the right. The tapered legs stood four square on the old wood floor. It was exactly the right size. Not coincidentally. He had measured the hall 3 times and told her the exact dimensions, and she had written them down, and he had built to the millimeter. She stood next to him and looked at it for a minute without saying anything. Then she said, "It's the best thing in the house." He was quiet. She said, "I mean that." Not politely. Genuinely. He looked at the table and then at the light on the grain, and then at the floor. He said, "I have a storage unit." He said this as though it followed from the table, which in some way it did. "I haven't opened it in 2 years. There are tools in there. Better than these." He nodded toward the garage. "I've been thinking I might open it." She looked at him. "There's a woodworking shop," she said, "over on Russell, the old machine space. They rent bench time by the day. I passed it on my walk last week. There was a sign in the window." He turned his head slightly. Not toward her, not quite, but she felt the direction of his attention change. "I'm not trying to arrange your life," she said. "I'm just telling you about a sign." He looked at the table. "There's a couple on my street," she said. "The Nguyen's, 2 houses down. They've been trying to restore an old secretary desk for 2 years, and they can't find anyone to do the joinery." She paused. "I may have mentioned you." He looked at her then, the full look. "Without asking," she said. "I know, but they're good people, and they have a secretary desk, and I saw what you just made. I thought it seemed relevant." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of condition is the desk in?" She almost smiled. "I honestly don't know. I can ask." By February, he had a room in a house on Lincoln Street, 3 blocks from the river in the other direction. The landlord was a retired electrician named Harv, who had 3 other tenants, and a rule about noise after 9, and a flexible attitude about first month's rent, a piece of information Mara had happened to obtain from Dolores, who knew everything about everything in a 4-block radius. He had opened the storage unit. She knew this because on a Tuesday morning she found a small piece of carved wood on her back step, just inside the door, placed with deliberate care rather than dropped. It was a curled shaving from a hand plane, the kind that comes off in a single long ribbon when the blade is perfectly sharp and the wood is perfect for planing, and someone had set it there rather than letting it fall to the floor. She put it in the bowl. She heard Dale's truck in the mornings sometimes, the particular sound of it going past on its way to wherever the day required. He had started with the Nguyen's secretary desk, and it had led to 3 other things, and those had led to 2 more. The specific geometry of reputation in a small place where people talk. She thought about Thomas sometimes when she stood in the hall and looked at the table. Not in the sharp way she used to think about him, the way that had made her catch her breath and have to set down whatever she was holding, in a softer way. She thought about how he would have loved the dovetail joints, would have run his thumb along the seam and then gotten Dale to explain the mechanics, would have listened with the attentive curiosity he'd had about all things that required skill he didn't personally possess. She thought he would have liked Dale. She thought, in a quieter way, that she sometimes allowed herself, that perhaps Dale had been down there by the river in October, in September, before she had known anything about it, and that Jasper had gone back and forth between them for weeks and weeks, and that this had not been accident or coincidence in any way she could comfortably describe. She was not a person who believed in much by way of the supernatural, but she had spent 2 years asking the world to send her a sign that some things still mattered, the way people ask in the hollow place grief leaves behind, not expecting an answer. And the answer had arrived through a cat door in a leather work glove. She had laughed at it. She thought Thomas would have found this very funny. Spring came late that year, the way it does in western Montana, teasing with warm days and then pulling them back, making you earn it. It was a Saturday morning in April, when Jasper came to her bedroom door with something in his mouth. She reached down without looking, the way she always did, and felt something small and curled between her fingers. It was a wood shaving, pale oak, tapered to nothing at one end, curled into a perfect spiral. She sat up in bed and held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment, and then she laughed, really laughed, the same involuntary sound from the first morning, and Jasper sat in the doorway and watched her with his inscrutable attention. She carried it to the kitchen. She put it in the bowl. She stood over the bowl for a while, looking at everything in it. The bottle cap, a little oxidized now, the orange mitten, the car keys nobody had claimed, the buttons, The torn right glove with the seam damage, still in there, still there since the day Dale had put it back. The flannel. The note. And now the shaving. Outside, somewhere on the block, she heard an engine, a particular truck. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Dale's pickup go by, heading somewhere with purpose. The table was in the hall behind her. The light was on it in the specific way it was on Tuesday mornings. She had started keeping a small jar of wildflowers on the table in spring, just a few, nothing elaborate, because a table like that deserved something on it. She thought about Jasper crossing 3 blocks of neighborhood in the dark, night after night, going to the river and coming back. She thought about all the things he had carried, the random and the intentional, the bottle caps and the gloves, the thread of connection running between a house and a riverbank that neither of its owners had yet found. She didn't know why a cat decides to bring something home. She had read about it. The theories were various and not very satisfying. Some behavioral, some territorial, some simply about the deep animal appetite for collecting, for bringing things in from the world outside to the place inside. None of the theories quite explained Jasper, who seemed to operate from a logic more complex and more patient than instinct accounted for. She had stopped needing to understand it. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor, and Jasper came to sit on her feet, the way he did when he had completed some task to his own satisfaction. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the yellow-green eyes that gave nothing away. "Thank you," she said. He blinked once, the long, slow blink that cats use for things they cannot be bothered to say in any other way. She put her coffee down and reached for her coat. She had told Dale she might stop by the Newens this morning, that she wanted to see how the secretary desk was coming along. She had not told him she was coming, but she thought that was all right. She thought, by now, that was all right. She went out the back door, down the step with the loose stone she had finally fixed in February, and walked into the morning. Jasper sat at the window and watched her go. The bowl of objects was on the counter in the quiet kitchen, the gloves in it, the note, the wood shaving, pale and curled, all the small things a cat had carried home, all the distance a cat had crossed. The table was in the hall, and the light was on the grain, and somewhere on Lincoln Street a truck was parked outside a storage unit full of tools that had been waiting 2 years for hands that remembered them. Spring was doing what spring does, insisting on itself, even through the cold. Neither of them had asked for any of this. But Jasper had known, if this story stayed with you, drop a simple 0 or a 1 in the comments below. It doesn't take a moment, and it helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you want to be here for the next one, the subscribe button is right there. There are more stories coming, some that will break you open a little, and some that will put you back together, and I'd be glad to share them with you.